Hello, I'm Ed Needham, editor of the fabulous literary magazine Strong Words, and this is my podcast, The 5 Rules of Writing. In each episode, I speak to a most excellent writer in a particular genre about how they do it. And if you'd like to know more about Strong Words, and specifically how to subscribe, go to www.strong-words.co.uk and you'll be whisked straight to the website. Hello and welcome to the 5 Rules of Writing, brought to you by Strong Words magazine. This is a podcast where I talk to writers about the 5 things they know to be true in writing. So whether that's experimental theatre or travel guides, there are some aspects of their work that are absolutely non-negotiable. And today I'd like to welcome a writer who's made it his business to frighten people. He's the writer of the 6 stories series of fictional investigations into supernaturally-tinged crimes, Matt Wesolowski. Welcome, Matt.
Hello. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thanks. Now, it's your latest book, Deity, is out now, as from today, I believe, as we speak. It's published by Render. It's about a creepy pop star. But Matt, could you describe your 6 stories format for those people who aren't yet familiar with it, and tell us what people can expect?
Of course, and I think you actually described it rather well just before. Each book is a series of a fictional true crime podcast. Each book is a cold case, and each book takes the form of interviews with people connected to the case, hosted by investigative journalist Scott King. Each book stands alone. There is some nice narrative running through if you do want to start from the start. And I guess it's for people who are interested in true crime, who like crime fiction, and also with a bit of the supernatural as well.
And how did you come across this idea of effectively writing it as a transcribed podcast?
Well, interestingly, I've never really been a crime reader, but I have been fascinated always by true crime. So I read a lot of Brian Master's books, his book about Dennis Nilsen, his book about Jeffrey Dahmer, and I always wanted to write a fictional true crime. And then when the first series of Serial came along, looking at the case of Hae-Min Lee's murder and her accused boyfriend, that was almost like a bit of an epiphany, because it was this brand new way of telling stories where an interviewer would talk to different people connected with that case. And with every episode, you got an almost different view of the case. So your theories would get changed with every episode. And I thought, what a cool new way of telling stories. Why don't I just have a shot and write something like that? And it was just for fun, really. It was just for me. It wasn't to try and get published or anything. I just wrote it to see what would happen. And it kind of was a little experiment.
A very successful one. You've always had a weakness for the supernatural as well, right? Where does that come from?
Oh man, yeah, that is just part of me. That is just who I am. I've been obsessed with the supernatural since I was a kid, since I read the Usborne Book of Ghosts, I think, in primary school. And it's hard to describe. I don't really know where it's come from, but it's there. And I've always wanted to be a horror writer as well. So horror, ghosts, monsters, that's just my thing. And when I was writing the first book, the first 6 stories book, I was writing it as just crime. I was trying to write straight crime, and I got stuck because I was feeling my passion for it was dwindling. And I've been reading about Inuit mythology, sort of as an aside, as you do for fun. And I thought, why don't I throw an Inuit demon into here? And then that sort of revitalized the whole thing. And I thought, this is me. This is how I write. I'm going to put a monster in if I want to, because that's me, and that feels more authentic, I suppose.
From Strong Words magazine, these are the 5 rules of writing. I mean, one of the things about your books is they are incredibly creepy. You know, I remember when I first read children's books or sort of ghost books as a child, really disappointed. You know, they were the idea of sort of ghost literature wasn't actually frightening, but rather more sort of just a sort of tone, and I ended up being very disappointed. Whereas your books are the real thing, aren't they? They do send a bit of a bit of a shiver down the spine. So the first rule is don't try and please anyone with your writing. Write about the things that you're passionate about. How do you communicate that sort of scariness that you are, as you say, passionate about?
Well, I think because when I read, I'm a bit like you. I'm always quite disappointed with books that are called horror and that don't frighten me. I want to be frightened and I want to be horrified. And I want to read a book that I don't want to go to the bathroom because I'm too scared, right? And I find too much that I read in the horror genre isn't frightening enough. So I want to be really scary, and I want to be the scariest I can possibly be. And so when I say don't try and please anyone, write what you're passionate about, I kind of write what I want to read. And that's a bit of a writer's cliche, write for yourself, but it's so true. And like I said with the 6 Stories book, it didn't feel enough like me. So I put some supernatural in there, and then it felt right. And I think that's a really important thing to do in your writing, is when it feels right, it flows. And when you're trying to think, oh, will people like this? That's where it inevitably doesn't work.
Do you sort of take a passion, which is a sort of vague pleasure, and turn into sort of ink on the page? But what's the process? Or did you just sit down and start writing, and this kind of came out at the end as if by magic?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I tend to, when I'm writing these books, now I usually get ideas from various different places. So usually I'll get an idea from true crime. So I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts. I also listen to a lot of mystery podcasts and like supernatural podcasts, and read a lot in both genres as well. So there'll be I always start with 2 little ideas. So for example, Deity, the latest book, I was thinking a lot about pop stars and heroes and how much we feel let down by them when allegations come out about them. And then I had this idea of a haunted forest, which is a recurring theme in a lot of my books. But then I thought, well, what if I can kind of combine the 2? And that's where I start. I start with these 2 things, and then it is a bit like, let's just see what happens. I don't plan what happens. So the endings tend to surprise me as well.
Okay. And is there an aspect of the paranormal that most intrigues you?
It depends, because some days there is, and some days it's other things. Like at the minute, I'm really into demon possession. So I've been reading a lot of books about demon possession and a lot of older books and accounts of demon possession. But like next week, it might be lake monsters, might be vampires. There's an endless possibility, and there's more stuff coming. Hydra, my second book, contains black-eyed children, which is quite a recent phenomena. And it was first started, I think, in the 90s. There was an account of a journalist meeting these weird children who knocked on the door of his car and asked to come in, and they had black eyes, and they gave him this terrible fear. And this became a bit of an internet phenomena, and it fascinated me. And I love finding new stuff to get interested in like that.
Okay. Now, rule 2, you say, is that you must make your characters real to you. You must be able to hear their voices and understand their pain. How do you do this? Especially in, because in horror writing, it has a terrible reputation for corniness, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Real.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things as well. Keep it like feeling authentic. I think like people are really complex, and people are odd, and real people are odd. And you've got to allow for a bit of oddness in there, because that's what makes people real. And I feel that with a character, you've got to hear them. For me anyway, because my books are written in dialogue, I've really got to sit and hear them. And sometimes it takes a little bit of a while for their voices to come. But it's funny, and I don't want to sound too pretentious, but it's almost like once I can hear them, they click, and their backstory almost just unfolds in my head. And it's very little effort to think about them, because once I hear their voice and once they start telling their story, they just come together, and there's no other way to describe it. But then I really have to listen, and I really have to hear that voice, and I have to concentrate on that voice and that story, and their idiosyncrasies and their passions and their pain, which isn't always normal, I guess. And it's about, yeah, not using cliche. And I'm really conscious of trying not to use cliche. And that's quite hard when you're writing, I think.
Do you have a particularly reliable source for sort of real voices? If you're really, is there a place you can go, or you know, a particular bus you like to get on?
No, I don't really go out and see people. No. I use a lot of memories, I guess. And I think as a writer, you tend to store these things in your head. You store odd little conversations. So if I'm really struggling, I'll think back to a person, because every character I think you write has a grounding in someone real. I don't write any characters as anyone, but there's often little bits of people I'll steal, or turns of phrase that I'll steal. So for example, I might think of a teacher I had maybe, and they used to say this. So I'll put it in there just as a pivot, you know, and then their story almost comes from there. So they're a bit like this teacher perhaps, or a bit like this bully. For example, the first book, 6 stories, the Tom Jeffries character was very much grounded in someone real. But we've all known a Tom Jeffries. We've all known a bully, a nasty little bully who picks on people. So he was quite an easy character to write because he was grounded in reality. So yeah, everything's grounded in reality, but isn't real people.
Okay. And in your work with underprivileged and disadvantaged children, have they helped at all?
Yeah, interestingly, some of the funny little turns of phrase and some of the stories have come from a lot of the young people I've worked with, only because they are really interesting. And when you speak to them and listen to their stories, it's like they're not stories I've experienced before, and like they're real life. You know, a lot of these kids come from really disadvantaged and underprivileged backgrounds, and some of their stories are heartbreaking, but they'll tell them with just such, like, it feels like it doesn't affect them, you know, when they tell you these stories. So a lot of them do come from there, and a lot of them are influenced by that. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we're going to move on to rule 3, which is to write authentically and from experience. Use this overlaps with what you've just been saying, but use things you've heard, memories, snippets of conversations, odd turns of phrase. Now, everyone, if allowed, would say that the first rule of writing is to read everything. Which written sources have you found to be most helpful?
Wow. So I think when written sources tend to be, and like this is going to be odd. So I read 40 Times magazine is probably my favorite magazine, and it's a paranormal magazine. And it's like a compilation of lots of odd news stories and articles written, people who've seen ghosts and UFOs and that sort of thing. And that tends to usually give me a good idea for the paranormal aspect of my work. Excuse me. There are a few writers that really, their voices are so strong that they have been massive influence on my work. Patrick McCabe is probably the first one. He's a writer I've loved since I was maybe about 16. And his work is very like stream of consciousness. It's like sort of deranged Roddy Doyle. He's a wonderful writer, but his having such a strong voice. So any writer who's got a strong voice like that, I will steal all bits of phrase, and all writers do this, and writers who say they don't are liars. But yeah, and I'll try and get that authenticity. What I want is when I'm reading a book that scares me or emotionally affects me, I want to do that. So I will read books that emotionally hurt me or frighten me, so I can try and replicate that passion, I think.
Okay. And any sort of first-hand supernatural experiences of your own that have helped?
Oh yeah, so I've experienced a few things. When I was a teenager, I lived in a flat with some friends in the West End of Newcastle, and that had a poltergeist, and it was really frightening. It would throw stuff down the stairs all night, and it would slam windows and that sort of thing. It was genuinely frightening. And I went up to Edinburgh to the Greyfriars churchyard, the haunted churchyard, and saw this sort of hooded thing coming at me, which was a really creepy experience. There's been a few. But it's more not about those experiences on the surface. It's more about the feeling they gave me and the fear they gave me. And I try and recall that fear and that panic and try and use that in writing, I suppose.
That poltergeists have a particular sort of tendency to throw shoes. Was that your experience? Was there a lot of shoe throwing in your haunted house?
Oh, I mean, back then we were all wearing great big New Rock boots, so I don't think it had the strength really. No, it threw. It was hard to know. Sometimes with poltergeists as well, because again, I've read quite a lot about poltergeists. They'll throw things that and not damage them, which is really weird. So they'll throw a tea set from a shelf, but it will be completely undamaged. Or you'll get pennies often they'll throw, and they will never really hurt anyone. What it used to do is throw things that weren't there. So you'd wake up with something clattering down the stairs, and you kind of wake up and there was nothing there, and that was pretty creepy.
Okay, and folklore as well. This is something else that plays a big part in your writing, sort of whether genuine folklore or folklore that you've sort of constructed for yourself. How do you use that to greatest effect?
Oh, I love folklore. Like, again, as a kid, and one of a big influence on my writing is reading folk stories. I've got tons of folklore books. I had this book when I was really young called Old English Folktales. I might actually have it right next to me. No, it's upstairs, I think. But yeah, Kevin Crossley Holland adapted a load of Old English folktales, and when I was a kid, I could pretty much recite all of them off by heart. I was so obsessed with them. And I think folklore has such deep roots in society, in every society. I've got books from Siberian folktales. I've got folktales from Norway. And they all have sort of recurrent themes which are steeped in us and our humanity. And I think being able to use those in literature is so powerful. And if you read someone like Andrew Michael Hurley is a really good example of someone who uses folklore and folk horror to a really, really devastating and powerful effect. He's a massive influence as well. And I think folklore has huge power.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So before, your rule 4 is to explore your locations with your characters. You never know what you'll find. How do you do?
Yeah, so when I'm creating a place, so everywhere in 6 stories, pretty much the big locations are made up, because I kind of feel like I'm not really good enough to write authentically someone else's idea. So if I wrote Newcastle, it would be my Newcastle. It wouldn't be your Newcastle. I don't know. I just don't have enough confidence. So I kind of like to make my own places up, but I don't really like to explore them. There is a way of writing, I suppose, where you are omnipotent. You are a god. You have created this place and you know everything. But I kind of like corners and alleyways and like disused canal towpaths and that sort of thing. And I like exploring them with my characters. So I don't really know what's going to be there. So when they're surprised, I'm surprised. And I find that much more fun rather than knowing what's around every corner.
Have you spent a lot of time in forests, in the shoes of your characters?
I love forests. Yeah, like we go quite a lot to the woods because we've got quite a lot of woods around here. We've got Northumberland, only about half an hour in the car, and just over the river we've got a lovely woodland that I've been going to since I was little as well. So yeah, I take my son. We walk in the woods. We tell each other stories. Yeah, there's something about the woods that gives me something. It almost replenishes my soul going into a wood.
You say you like taking your son into the woods. You're quite keen on walking with your lad in the woods. Do you spend more time trying to frighten him or trying to reassure him?
He's very he's not frightened of stuff like that. We spend a lot of the time in the woods with him picking up sticks and having adventures and being characters, or I often tell him folk tales. I mean, he's getting a bit old for that now. He kind of wants to run off into the into the woods, but I would just sort of tell him, all the folk tales I know off by heart, and that was quite nice.
And what sort of locations have been toughest to populate?
I think when I'm writing about somewhere real has been hard. So there's a few various, I think in my fourth book, Beast, I wrote there was a graveyard in Bristol that I went to, as you do. And that was quite hard because that was a real place. So anywhere real, I really struggle with because I want to get it right. And I will sit for hours getting a street right or researching a town just so I can get a feel of it, and that's the hardest for me.
Okay. And rule 5, Matt, you say fear is in the mind of the reader. How do you put it there?
I think one of the big lessons in fear is there's a movie called Night of the Demon. I don't know if you know it.
I'm not familiar with that one.
It's really good, apart from the last sort of 10 minutes when you actually see the monster. It's a wonderfully scary movie, but it's all ruined at the end because the monster's rubbish. It's like this big rubber thing. I mean, it's cool, but it's not frightening. And I think the way I want to scare people is the fear is what you make of it. So I could write a big scary monster and that might scare me, but it might not scare you, But what I can scare you with is using your own fears against you. So I'm very much writing in the sense that I don't want to show too much, that I want to hint at that fear, to almost let the reader construct the fear for themselves. I think that's really important in writing.
And why do you think people like being frightened so much?
Oh man, I don't know. There's probably like a really intelligent psychological reason why. And I mean, it's probably a bit of escapism because you are sat and you're safe and it's all in your head really, but it gives you that thrill. Maybe about riding a roller coaster, it's that idea of being near to death. Or maybe there's something deep rooted in us. I mean, folk stories were there to frighten us. If you take every country has a river monster story or a lake monster story, and they were cautionary. They were about making sure children don't go near the water. I mean, you can say to a child, don't go near the water, or you can say to a child, something is going to reach and grab you. And that has much more powerful effect. And I think fear is used by us as people, as storytellers. And there's something in us that we like about it. And I don't think I know why, but I love it.
And is there a sort of a sort of an all-time favorite supernatural mystery that is, that has always been with you? Is there and sort of number one in your pantheon of supernatural?
Yeah, I really like the ones that just can't be explained, the ones that no one's got an explanation for. So the Mary Celeste is a good one, is a really good example of that. There's never been anything conclusive about the Mary Celeste. There's also a good one from up around here called the Hexen Heads, which is a really sort of overlooked, really idiosyncratic story about these two young boys who found what they think was these Roman artifacts in their garden. And it was these two little stone heads. And they found that when they had them in the house, their parents kept waking up and seeing this terrifying, like half sheep, half human specter in the house. The heads were eventually lost and still no one actually knows where they are. But there's accounts of people who had them seeing this creature, and there's so many theories about them. Were they real? Did someone make them? Was it all a hoax? Were they these cursed Bronze Age artifacts? Stuff like that. I love it.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Magnificent. Matt, thank you so much for talking to me. Best of luck with your book. It's called Deity and it's published by Arenda. I hope it finds a gigantic audience because it very much deserves one. And best of luck with frightening people in the future.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
From Strong Words magazine, these are the 5 rules of writing.